Let's get started on Chapter 16, Configuring Group Policy. In this chapter, we will look at the disadvantage of configuring a large number of computers, and we will look at group policy. We will look at the variables that group policy can configure and at applying group policy at different levels. We will look at understanding the group policy order of application at GPO blocking and at GPO filtering. Let's first look at configuring computers one at a time. If you were to install Microsoft Office or disable a firewall on one computer, it wouldn't take so long. But if you had a large number of computers and you had to walk around to each individual computer to install Microsoft Office or to disable the firewall, that could be awfully labor intensive. Here at the Community College of Baltimore County, we have 5,000 desktop computers. So to walk around to each individual computer to install Microsoft Office or to configure the firewall would be extremely time consuming. This is why we have group policy. Group policy allows us to centrally configure all users and all computers in the domain, so we don't have to walk around to each individual computer to configure it. A group policy object is a file which is located on the domain controller and which applies to all users and computers in the domain. Let's look at some examples of variables that group policy can configure. They fall into three general categories: security, desktop, and remote installation of applications. In security, they fall into two subcategories: user and computer. User security parameters I might configure might include password policies, account lockout, or folder redirection. And computer parameters I might configure might be the restriction of USB flash drives or the configuring of a firewall. Desktop parameters might include removing the Internet Explorer from the desktop, or desktop parameters might be used to configure it such that all users have the same desktop background. Here at CCBC, all 5,000 computers have the CCBC logo, and I guarantee you we didn't walk around to every single computer to give it the CCBC logo. We put that logo up on the domain controller and it was pushed down to every computer in the domain. And one of the most convenient aspects of group policy is the ability to remotely install applications. What we do is we put the install files for Microsoft Office up on the server, and then those applications are pushed down to the workstations, and that saves us the trouble of walking around to each workstation to install applications. Let's look at the default domain policy. The default domain policy applies to all users and all computers in the domain. To get to the default domain policy, we go to Server Manager, and under Tools, we select Group Policy Management. And this takes us to the Group Policy Management console. We select CCBC, and under ccbcmd.edu, we select the default domain policy. We could configure policy per organizational unit, but right now we will look at the default domain policy. If I right-click on the default domain policy and select Edit, this takes me to the default domain policy, the Group Policy Management Editor. If I expand Policies, and then I expand Windows Settings, and then I go into Security Settings, and I go into Account Policies, I can see Account Policies contains Password Policy and Account Lockout Policy. If I go to the Password Policy, we can see that these passwords configure user password requirements. For example, minimum password length. If I right-click on minimum password length and select Properties, we can configure it such that all users must have a password, and that password must be 7 characters long, at least. And this applies to all users in the domain. We can configure the maximum password age such that the user has to change the password every 42 days or every 90 days or once a year, just depending upon how secure your environment is. And we can configure enforced password history, whereby the system remembers the user's last 24 passwords so the user can't use the same password again and again. These are password policies. Now let's look at the account lockout policy. Right now, the account lockout policy is not currently configured. If I right-click on the account lockout policy and select Properties, and I configure the number to be 5, here's what I'm doing. Right here it says account will be locked after 5 invalid login attempts. This is to protect against bad guys who are trying to break in by guessing passwords. If somebody gets the password wrong 5 times, then the account will be locked. How long will the account be locked for? If I click on OK and OK, we can now see that if the user gets the password wrong 5 times in a 30-minute period of time, then the account will be locked for 30 minutes. If you want to, you might want to push this up to 24 hours or even 48 hours if it's in a more secure environment. Another parameter we can look at under user configuration, if we select policies, and under Windows settings, if we select folder redirection and we select documents, and we select properties, we can configure it such that when a user saves a file, that file will be redirected to the user's home directory. Typically, when a user saves a file, it is saved to the documents file on the hard disk of the local PC where the user is standing. But if we configure folder redirection, then any data files which are saved to the documents folder will be redirected to the user's home directory, which is located up on the server. This is called folder redirection. Another parameter which we can configure under Windows Administrative Templates is control of the desktop. What we can do is we can hide the Internet Explorer on the desktop. So if we don't want users to be able to surf the internet on the job, what we do is we right-click and we select Edit, and this allows us to hide the Internet Explorer. Now you might think I am going to click on Disabled because I want to disable the use of the Internet Explorer. But notice the name of this policy is Hide the Internet Explorer. So if I enable that policy, then what I will be doing will be hiding the Internet Explorer so users can't surf the internet on the job. Another parameter that I can configure under System, under Removable Storage Access, you notice there's an option here that says All Removable Storage Classes. What we can do is prevent users from using USB flash drives. If I right-click here and I select Edit, what I can do is deny users the ability to use USB flash drives. And the reason I might want to do that is because a common way that viruses get introduced into secure systems is through USB flash drives. Now, of course, if you disable it, it's inconvenient for the users. But if you are in a highly secure environment, you don't want users to use the USB flash drives. So you might think I would click on Disable to disable the use of USB flash drives. But notice that the name of the policy is to deny access to all removable storage drives. So if I click on Enable, I am enabling the policy that disables access to the USB flash drive. Another parameter we can configure is Firewall. If I go under Firewall, I can configure the firewall settings, and when I do, this will apply to all computers in the domain. And if we go under Software Settings, under Software Installation, what we can do is we can put the installation files for Microsoft Office up on the server, and then they can be pushed down to every workstation in the domain to save me the trouble of walking around every computer and individually installing Microsoft Office. So some of the examples of variables that group policy can configure include security parameters, user security parameters such as password policies, account lockout, or folder direction, or computer security parameters such as restricting the use of USB flash drives or configuring the firewall. It can be used to hide the Internet Explorer on the desktop and can be used to ensure that everybody has the same desktop background. And a real convenient feature of group policy is the ability to put the Microsoft Office install files up on the server and have group policy push them down to the user's workstations. Group policy, if it's configured for the entire domain, then it will apply to all users and all computers in the domain. You can configure group policy domain-wide, or you can configure group policy per organizational unit. If you configure group policy per organizational unit, then those group policy configuration parameters will only apply to the users and computers in that organizational unit and any organizational units that might be under that organizational unit. So to configure group policy to apply for just one organizational unit, we go to the Group Policy Management Console and we don't select default domain policy. We select the organizational unit that we want to create a new policy. So I will right-click and select Create a Group Policy Object in this domain and link it here. I click on that and then I type in a name for the group policy object, such as Group Policy Object for Organizational Unit 1, and I will click on OK, and there it is. To edit it, I right-click on it and I select Edit, and this now brings up the Group Policy Management Editor for just Organizational Unit 1. And then if I want to go into removable storage properties, I can configure it such that USB drives will not be available for users and computers, but just in this organizational unit. So you can see the group policy object can be configured at the domain level, in which case it applies to all organizational units and all objects in all organizational units. Or group policy object can be configured per organizational unit, in which case it only applies to the users and the computers in that organizational unit. Group policy object can be applied at different levels. For example, group policy can be applied at the domain level, in which case it applies to all users and all computers in the domain. If we configure group policy at the site level, then that will apply to all users and computers at that particular site. In our case, the Community College of Baltimore County, our three main sites are the Catonsville campus, the Essex campus, and the Dundalk campus. Group policy can be configured at the organizational unit level, and you usually think of an organizational unit as a department. Or group policy object can be configured for one single computer. Conflicting group policies. If group policy has been set, if group policy has different settings at different levels, then which one wins? And the answer is based upon the order of application. The first group policies that are applied are the local policies, followed by the site policies, followed by the domain policies, followed by the organizational unit policies. If there are no site policies, well, then they won't apply to anything. Usually policies are just configured at the domain and the organizational unit level if you have one single geographic site. The funny way to remember this is LSDOU, local, site, domain, and organizational unit. So let's look at an example. If you have removed the Internet Explorer from the desktop in the domain group policy object, and then you add Internet Explorer to the desktop in organizational unit 1, which one wins? Well, if we look at the order of application, we see LSDOU. Local, we're not talking about. Site, not even configured. domain and then organizational unit. So first domain is configured, which removes the Internet Explorer, and then organizational unit is applied, which adds the Internet Explorer back. So which one wins is the organizational unit. Group policy object inheritance. If group policy is assigned at the domain level, it flows down to all organizational units under that domain. But what if you don't want domain policy to flow down to your organizational unit? Well, then what you can do is you can block the group policy. If you block group policy, then that prevents the domain policy from flowing down to your organizational unit. In order to block the domain policy from flowing down into organizational unit 1, I go to organizational unit 1 and I right-click and I select block inheritance. When I click on block inheritance, notice a little blue exclamation point shows up indicating that group policy has been blocked from being inherited from the default domain policy. Blocking inheritance prevents the group policy from flowing down from a higher level. Overriding group policy blocking. What if you are the enterprise administrator and you don't want the domain policy to be blocked? So here's what you do. To do that, you select Enforce. When you select Enforce, then that overrides any group policy object blocking that may have been set up. To configure Enforce, you go to the default domain policy, right-click, and you select Enforce. And I click on Enforce, and then notice a little lock appears right there to indicate that the group policies will be pushed through any blocks that may have been set up at a lower level. Blocking blocks inheritance, and Enforce overrides any blocks that may have been put in place. Now let's look at group policy object security filtering. Typically, group policy is applied to all users and all computers in the domain or in the organizational unit that it's been applied to. But if you want to configure group policy to apply only to a specific group, that's when we implement group policy object filtering. To implement group policy object filtering, if you will look under security filtering, you will see that currently the default domain policy applies to all authenticated users in the domain. If you don't want it to apply to all users, but only to a particular group, you remove the authenticated users, and then you click on Add, followed by Advanced, followed by Find Now, and then you select the group that you want that group policy to apply to. I will click on OK and OK, and now you can see that the group policy no longer applies to all users, but only to a particular group. Controlling who group policy applies to. A couple different ways. Group policy can be applied to the entire domain, or group policy can be applied to an individual site, or to an organizational unit, or to a single computer. Group policy can be inherited or it can be blocked. It can be enforced to override the block, and security filtering can be used such that the group policy does not apply to all users in the domain or the organizational unit, but only to a particular group of users. Chapter 16, Summary. In this chapter, we saw that a group policy object is a configuration file which sits on the domain controller, but which can apply to all users and all computers in the domain. We looked at the variables that group policy can configure, and we looked at the different levels at which we can configure group policy. We looked at group policy order of application, at group policy object blocking, and at group policy object filtering. And this concludes Chapter 16. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.